The betrayal. The night was darker than any other in the kingdom of Valdoria, and the silence that filled the ancient castle was the kind that made even the bravest soldiers feel a cold shiver running down their spine. King Alaric stood alone at the highest tower of his castle, his pale hands gripping the stone railing so tightly that small cracks appeared beneath his fingers. His crimson eyes, eyes that had seen over 500 years of war, peace, love, and loss, were now fixed on the horizon where the moon cast its silver light over the sleeping kingdom below. But Alaric was not admiring the beauty of his lands tonight. No, tonight he was trying to understand how the woman he had loved more than his own eternal existence could have destroyed everything they had built together with a single act of betrayal. 300 years ago, when Alaric was still a young vampire learning to control his thirst and his powers, he had never imagined that he would one day become the ruler of the largest vampire kingdom in the world. He had been born into a noble family, but his path to the throne was paved with blood, sacrifice, and countless battles against enemies who wanted to see his kind destroyed forever. The humans feared vampires, and in those early days, the two species lived in constant war, each side believing that the other was the enemy that needed to be eliminated. But Alaric was different from the other vampires of his time, because he believed that peace was possible, that vampires and humans could learn to live together if only they could find common ground and mutual respect. It took him 200 years of careful diplomacy, strategic marriages between vampire nobles and human royalty, and the establishment of laws that protected both species equally before the Kingdom of Valdoria finally knew true peace. Under Alaric's rule, humans no longer lived in fear of being hunted, and vampires no longer had to hide in the shadows like monsters. The kingdom flourished, trade routes opened between vampire and human territories, and for the first time in centuries, children of both species played together in the streets without their parents watching in terror. Alaric had created something beautiful, something that many had said was impossible, and at the center of this achievement stood the woman who had been his greatest source of strength and inspiration. Alina was not born a vampire. She was a human princess from a neighboring kingdom that had been one of the last to accept peace with the vampire nation. When Alaric first saw her at a diplomatic gathering, she was only 22 years old, with hair as dark as midnight and eyes the color of warm honey that seemed to glow with an inner fire. She was not afraid of him like so many humans were when they stood in the presence of the vampire king. Instead, she met his gaze directly and spoke to him with a confidence that took his breath away, which was remarkable considering that vampires did not actually need to breathe. From that very first moment, Alaric knew that Alina was unlike any woman he had ever met in his long existence, and he found himself completely captivated by her spirit. Their courtship lasted 5 years, during which Alina learned everything about vampire culture, history, and the responsibilities that would come with becoming the Queen of Valdoria. Alaric never pressured her to become a vampire herself, telling her that the choice would always be hers to make when and if she was ready. Alina studied with the wisest scholars in the kingdom, trained with the most skilled warriors, and spent countless hours learning how to govern alongside her future husband. She proved herself not only to be intelligent and capable, but also kind-hearted and compassionate, often visiting the poor districts of the kingdom to ensure that every citizen, whether vampire or human, had food, shelter, and medicine when they needed it. The people of Valdoria grew to love her almost as much as Alaric did, and when they finally married in a ceremony that united representatives from every corner of the realm, there was not a single person who doubted that she would be an exceptional queen. Alina chose to become a vampire on their wedding night, and Alaric performed the transformation himself, cradling her in his arms as her human life ended and her eternal existence began. For the next 50 years, they ruled Valdoria together in perfect harmony, their love growing stronger with each passing decade. Alina brought new ideas to the kingdom, introducing programs that educated young vampires about controlling their hunger without harming humans, establishing sanctuaries where wounded animals could be healed, and creating festivals that celebrated the unique cultures of both species. Alaric watched his wife with endless admiration, grateful every single day that fate had brought her into his life. He trusted her completely, sharing with her every secret of the kingdom, every vulnerability, every fear that he had never admitted to anyone else. She was his partner, his confidant, his soulmate, and he believed with absolute certainty that their bond was unbreakable. But Alaric was wrong, and his blindness to the truth would soon become the source of the greatest pain he had ever experienced. The first signs of trouble appeared so gradually that Alaric did not recognize them for what they were. Alina began spending more time away from the castle, explaining that she was visiting the outer provinces to check on the welfare programs she had established. Alaric thought nothing of it, proud of her dedication to the people and happy to support her work in any way he could. She returned from these trips tired but fulfilled, telling him stories about the grateful families she had met and the improvements she had witnessed in the most remote villages of the kingdom. He had no reason to doubt her, no reason to question the woman who had stood beside him through every challenge and every triumph. When she started receiving private messages that she quickly hid whenever he entered the room, he told himself that she was probably planning a surprise for their upcoming anniversary. When she seemed distracted during their conversations, her mind clearly somewhere far away, he assumed that she was simply overwhelmed by her many responsibilities. It was Lord Marcus, one of Alaric's oldest and most trusted advisors, who finally came to him with the truth that shattered his world into a million pieces. Marcus had served the Vampire King for over 400 years, and in all that time he had never seen the elderly vampire look so uncomfortable as he did when he entered the throne room that fateful evening. His hands were trembling, his eyes refused to meet Alaric's gaze, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told Alaric that he had discovered something that the king needed to know, something that would cause him immense pain, but something that could not remain hidden any longer. Alina, the beloved queen of Valdoria, had been meeting secretly with a human nobleman named Lord Darius for the past 2 years. The meetings had started innocently enough, discussions about trade agreements and border policies, but they had evolved into something far more intimate. Marcus presented Alaric with evidence that he could not deny, letters written in Alina's own handwriting that spoke of love, passion, and plans for a future that did not include the Vampire King. In these letters, Alina described Alaric as a cold and distant husband, a monster who could never truly understand the warmth of human emotion, a creature she had grown to resent despite the power and luxury he provided. She wrote about how Darius made her feel alive again, how his human heart beat with a fire that no vampire could ever possess, how she dreamed of escaping Valdoria and starting a new life far away from the eternal darkness of Alaric's world. The letters were filled with promises of what they would do once they were finally together, plans that included stealing ancient vampire artifacts that Darius could sell to collectors who paid fortunes for such rare items. Alaric read every single letter 3 times, hoping that somehow the words would change, that he would discover this was all a terrible mistake or a cruel joke. But the evidence was undeniable, the handwriting was definitely Alina's, and the details in the letters matched perfectly with the times she had claimed to be visiting the outer provinces. 50 years of marriage, 50 years of absolute trust and devotion, and it had all been a lie. The pain that filled Alaric's chest was unlike anything he had experienced in his 5 centuries of existence, worse than the silver blade that had once pierced his heart during the Great War, worse than the loss of his parents when he was just a young vampire learning to survive in a hostile world. But then something remarkable happened within the Vampire King's tortured soul. The pain that had threatened to destroy him began to transform into something else, something that burned with a cold and steady flame. He thought about the kingdom he had sacrificed everything to build, the thousands of vampires and humans who depended on him for protection and leadership, the legacy that he had worked for 3 centuries to create. He thought about the respect that he had earned through his dedication to justice and peace, and he realized that he could not allow this betrayal to define him. Alina had made her choice, and now he would make his. Alaric summoned his most trusted generals and advisors to the throne room, and when they stood before him in the flickering candlelight, they immediately sensed that something terrible had happened. Their king, who had always been composed and controlled, now radiated an energy that made the air itself feel heavy and electric. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an undertone that sent chills through everyone present. He told them that the queen had betrayed the kingdom, that she had been conspiring with outside forces and sharing secrets that could endanger everything they had built together. He did not mention the personal nature of the betrayal, the broken heart that lay beneath his words, because a king must always put his kingdom before his own feelings. The generals awaited his orders, expecting him to call for immediate arrests and perhaps even executions, because that was the traditional punishment for treason in the vampire world. But Alaric surprised them all with his next words, words that would set in motion a series of events that would shake the very foundations of Valdoria and beyond. He would not punish Alina with violence or imprisonment. No, his revenge would be something far more powerful and unexpected. He would show her and the entire world what she had thrown away. And as the first rays of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, forcing the vampire court to retreat to their shadowed chambers, a single messenger slipped out of the castle with a sealed letter addressed to Lord Darius himself. The vampire king's revenge had begun, and no one, not even Alaric himself, could predict how it would end. Oh, the unraveling. 3 days had passed since Alaric sent his mysterious message to Lord Darius, and during those 3 days the vampire king had not spoken a single word to his queen. Alina noticed the change immediately, the way her husband no longer met her eyes during council meetings, the way he excused himself from dinner every evening with explanations about urgent matters that required his attention, the way the warmth that had always existed between them seemed to have vanished completely. At first, she convinced herself that he was simply stressed about some political situation that he would eventually share with her. But as the silence stretched on, a cold fear began to grow in her heart. She tried to approach him one night, waiting for him in his private study where they had spent countless hours discussing the future of their kingdom. The room was filled with ancient books, maps of territories that had not existed for centuries, and portraits of Alaric's ancestors who watched from the walls with their painted crimson eyes. When Alaric finally entered, he stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and for a single moment, Alina saw something flash across his face that she had never seen before, a mixture of pain, disappointment, and something else that she could not identify but that made her stomach twist with dread. She asked him what was wrong, reaching out to touch his arm, but he stepped away from her as if her hand was made of burning silver. His voice, when he finally spoke, was perfectly calm and controlled, but there was an emptiness behind his words that terrified her more than any anger could have. He told her that he had received some disturbing reports about the outer provinces and that he would need to investigate them personally. He would be leaving the castle in the morning for an extended journey, and she would remain behind to handle the daily affairs of the kingdom. Before she could respond, before she could ask any questions or try to understand what was happening, he was gone, and she was left standing alone in the study surrounded by the watchful eyes of his ancestors. What Alina did not know was that Alaric's journey was not taking him to the outer provinces at all. Instead, the vampire king traveled in secret to the human territories, to a modest estate that belonged to a minor nobleman named Lord Darius. The letter that Alaric had sent 3 days earlier was an invitation, carefully worded to appear as if it came from a potential business partner interested in trading rare artifacts. Darius, driven by greed and the thrill of acquiring vampire treasures, had eagerly agreed to a meeting, never suspecting that he was walking into a trap carefully laid by the most powerful vampire in the known world. The meeting took place at sunset, in a small inn located at the crossroads between human and vampire lands. Darius arrived first, a handsome man in his late 30s with confident eyes and a charming smile that had won him many admirers throughout his life. He was dressed in expensive clothing that spoke of his ambition to rise above his station, and he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed he could outsmart anyone. When Alaric entered the inn, disguised as a simple merchant with a hood covering his distinctive features, Darius did not recognize the vampire king whose queen he had been seducing for the past 2 years. They sat at a corner table, ordered wine that Alaric did not touch, and began discussing the supposed artifact trade. Alaric listened patiently as Darius boasted about his connections, his knowledge of vampire artifacts, and his ability to acquire items that most humans could never dream of possessing. The vampire king asked questions, drawing out more and more information, learning about the network of thieves and smugglers that Darius had built over the years. And then, when Darius mentioned that he had a source very close to the vampire court, someone who could provide access to treasures that had been hidden for centuries, Alaric finally revealed his true identity. The transformation in Darius was immediate and almost comical. His face went pale, his hands began to shake, and the confidence that had defined his every movement evaporated like morning mist under the sun. He tried to stand, tried to run, but Alaric's hand on his shoulder held him in place with a strength that no human could ever hope to match. The Vampire King's crimson eyes glowed in the dim light of the inn, and when he smiled, his fangs were visible just enough to remind Darius of the danger he was in. But Alaric did not threaten the human nobleman with violence, did not speak of punishments or revenge. Instead, he leaned close and whispered something into Darius's ear, something that made the color drain from the man's face completely. What Alaric told Darius was simple but devastating. He revealed that Alina had not been sharing secrets because she loved him, but because she was using him. The Vampire King had spent the past 3 days investigating not only the affair but also Alina's true motivations, and what he had discovered painted a very different picture than the romance that Darius believed they shared. Alina had been feeding Darius information carefully selected to make him believe he was gaining power, but in reality, she had been manipulating him to build her own network of contacts in the human world. She planned to eventually betray him too, taking the fortune he had accumulated and disappearing to start a new life without either the Vampire King or her human lover. Darius did not want to believe it at first, insisting that Alina loved him, that she had promised they would be together. But Alaric presented proof, letters that Alina had written to other contacts, letters that spoke of Darius as a useful fool who would be discarded when his purpose was served. The human nobleman read these letters with trembling hands, and as he did, tears began to stream down his face. He had been deceived, used, and the woman he thought loved him had been playing a game that he never understood. When he looked up at Alaric, expecting death, expecting punishment for daring to touch the vampire queen, he found something unexpected in the king's ancient eyes. He found understanding. Alaric told Darius that they had both been victims of the same betrayal, that they had both trusted someone who did not deserve their trust. He offered the human nobleman a choice. Darius could help him expose Alina's schemes publicly, showing the kingdom and the world what kind of person she truly was, or he could refuse and spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering when the Vampire King's revenge would finally come. It was not really a choice at all, and both of them knew it. Darius agreed to cooperate, and together, the unlikeliest of allies began planning the next phase of Alaric's revenge. Back at the castle, Alina was growing increasingly paranoid. She had tried to contact Darius multiple times, but her messages went unanswered. She had sent servants to gather information about her husband's journey, but they returned with confusing reports about the king being seen in places that made no sense. The other nobles of the court had started looking at her differently, their conversations stopping when she entered a room, their smiles seeming forced and uncomfortable. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and she had no way of knowing what it was or how to stop it. On the 7th day of Alaric's absence, Alina received a formal invitation that made her blood run cold. It was an announcement of a grand celebration to be held at the castle in 3 weeks, a celebration honoring the 50th anniversary of her transformation from human to vampire. The invitation was beautifully written, decorated with gold leaf and the royal seal, but what caught Alina's attention was the guest list attached to the back. Every noble family in the vampire kingdom would be attending, along with representatives from the human territories, including minor nobles from regions that she had claimed to be visiting during her secret meetings with Darius. She understood then that Alaric knew that her husband had somehow discovered her betrayal and was planning something that would happen at this celebration. Her first instinct was to run, to take whatever treasures she could carry and disappear before the trap could close around her. But she was a vampire now, a member of the most powerful court in the world, and running would only confirm her guilt while giving up everything she had worked for. She decided instead to stay, to face whatever was coming, and to find a way to turn the situation to her advantage. What Alina did not understand, what she could not possibly comprehend because she had never truly known her husband's heart, was that Alaric's revenge was not about punishment at all. The Vampire King did not want to destroy Alina, did not want to see her suffer or die. What he wanted was something far more meaningful. He wanted to show the kingdom what true strength looked like, what true leadership meant, and how a king could transform personal tragedy into a lesson that would inspire generations to come. The celebration was approaching, and all of Valdoria was buzzing with excitement about the grand event. Rumors spread about surprise announcements, about guests from distant lands who had never before visited the Vampire Kingdom, about entertainment that would leave everyone speechless. Alina watched these preparations with growing dread, knowing that whatever Alaric had planned would change her life forever, but unable to imagine what form his revenge would take. She had prepared herself for anger, for violence, for the kind of dramatic confrontation that she had seen in old stories about betrayed kings and unfaithful queens. But when Alaric finally returned to the castle on the eve of the celebration, he did not confront her at all. He smiled at her politely, asked about the affairs of the kingdom during his absence, and behaved as if nothing was wrong. That night, as she lay awake in her chambers, Alina realized that this calm was far more terrifying than any rage could ever be. Her husband was playing a game that she did not understand, and for the first time since she had joined the vampire court, she felt completely powerless. The celebration began at sunset, with hundreds of guests streaming into the castle's great hall. The room was decorated with flowers and crystals that caught the candlelight. Musicians played haunting melodies from a raised platform, and servants moved through the crowd offering goblets of fine wine mixed with the finest quality blood from willing donors. Alina stood beside Alaric at the head of the room, wearing a stunning dress of deep red that matched her husband's royal robes, and she smiled at every guest who approached to offer congratulations while her heart pounded with fear about what was to come. As the night progressed and no disaster occurred, Alina began to hope that perhaps she had been wrong, that perhaps Alaric did not know her secrets after all. But then, just as the clock struck midnight, the king called for silence and stepped forward to address his guests. His voice rang out clear and strong, filling every corner of the massive hall, and what he said next would be remembered for centuries. He announced that on this special anniversary, he wished to honor his queen by sharing a story about transformation, not the physical transformation from human to vampire, but the transformation of the soul that happened when someone faced betrayal with grace instead of vengeance. And as he spoke, Alina felt the ground shift beneath her feet because she realized that her husband was about to reveal everything to the entire kingdom. But the words that came next were not the accusations she expected. They were something far more unexpected, far more powerful, and they would change everything she thought she knew about the vampire king she had betrayed. The redemption. The great hall was completely silent as Alaric's words hung in the air like morning mist waiting to be burned away by the rising sun. Every vampire and human in the room stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the king who had just announced that he wished to speak about betrayal and grace. Alina's hands trembled at her sides, and she prepared herself for the public humiliation that she was certain would follow. She had made peace with the idea that her secrets would be exposed, that her reputation would be destroyed, and that she would spend the rest of her eternal existence as an outcast, despised by the very people she had once ruled. But what happened next was something she could never have predicted, something that defied everything she knew about power, revenge, and the nature of the vampire king she had betrayed. Alaric turned to face his queen directly, and for the first time in weeks he truly looked at her. His crimson eyes, which she had expected to find filled with hatred and contempt, held an emotion that she could not immediately identify. It was not love, not exactly, but it was not the cold fury she had anticipated either. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but carried to every corner of the hall, ensuring that every guest could hear clearly what he was about to say. He told the gathered nobles that 50 years ago, he had married a human princess who he believed was his perfect match, his soulmate, the one person in all the world who understood him completely. He confessed that he had been wrong. The audience stirred uncomfortably, uncertain where this speech was leading. Alina felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, preparing herself for the final blow. But Alaric continued, and his next words shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. He explained that he had discovered only recently that his queen had been keeping secrets from him, that she had been building connections outside of the kingdom, and that she had been planning a life that did not include him. He paused, letting this sink in, and Alina could feel the judgment of hundreds of eyes upon her, the whispers already beginning at the edges of the crowd. But then Alaric raised his hand for silence and spoke again, and what he said changed everything. He admitted that when he first discovered his wife's betrayal, he had felt the kind of pain that only immortals can truly understand, a pain that seemed to stretch forward into centuries of loneliness and regret. He had wanted revenge, had craved the satisfaction of seeing her suffer as she had made him suffer. He had planned an elaborate scheme to humiliate her before the entire kingdom, to strip her of her titles and her power, to make an example of what happened to those who betrayed the vampire king. The crowd was completely silent now, every person straining to hear what would come next. Alina was crying openly, no longer caring about appearances, knowing that she deserved whatever punishment was about to be announced. But instead of condemning her, Alaric did something that no one in that room had ever seen him do before. He turned to his queen, took her trembling hands in his own, and told her that he had been wrong too. He confessed that in his pursuit of building a kingdom, in his obsession with creating peace between vampires and humans, he had neglected the one person who should have mattered most. He had assumed that Alina was happy because she never complained, that she was fulfilled because she was doing good work, that their relationship was strong because she never left. He had stopped truly seeing her, stopped asking what she needed, stopped being the partner he had promised to be when they married half a century ago. He had become so focused on being a good king that he had forgotten how to be a good husband. The confession sent shockwaves through the audience. Never in the history of Valdoria had a vampire king publicly acknowledged his own failures, his own mistakes, his own role in the problems of his marriage. Kings were supposed to be perfect, above criticism, beyond reproach. But Alaric stood before his subjects with vulnerability written on his ancient face, showing them a different kind of strength, the strength it took to look honestly at oneself and admit the truth. He explained that over the past 3 weeks, while planning what he thought would be his ultimate revenge, he had spent many hours in reflection and meditation. He had consulted with the wisest advisors in the kingdom, not about strategy or punishment, but about matters of the heart. He had read ancient texts about love and forgiveness, about the difference between justice and vengeance, about what it truly meant to be a leader. And in all of this searching, he had discovered a truth that transformed everything. Revenge, Alaric told the assembled nobles, was the refuge of the weak. Any person with power could punish those who wronged them, could destroy lives and shatter dreams, could make others suffer for the pain they had caused. But true strength, the kind of strength that built lasting kingdoms and inspired genuine loyalty, came not from the ability to destroy but from the courage to rebuild. He had spent 300 years creating peace between species that had been at war for millennia. Could he not find a way to create peace within his own heart? Alina was sobbing now, overwhelmed by emotions she could not name or control. She had expected hatred and found something far more devastating. She had prepared for punishment and received instead a mirror reflecting her own failures back at her. When Alaric asked if she had anything she wished to say, she found that words failed her completely. She simply stood there, tears streaming down her face, feeling the weight of 50 years of small betrayals that had led to the larger one, 50 years of choosing fear over honesty, of building walls instead of bridges with the one person who had given her everything. But Alaric was not finished. He announced that he would not be punishing his queen for her betrayal, because punishment would only create more pain, more resentment, more brokenness in a kingdom that had already seen too much suffering. Instead, he was making a different choice, a choice that he hoped would demonstrate to all of Valdoria what he believed their kingdom should represent. He called forth Lord Darius, who had been waiting in a side chamber, nervous and uncertain about his role in this grand drama. The human nobleman walked into the great hall with his head bowed, expecting to be identified as the queen's lover, expecting to be condemned for his part in the betrayal. But Alaric welcomed him with a formal bow, greeting him as a guest rather than an enemy. The king announced that Darius would be offered a position in the diplomatic corps, helping to strengthen the relationships between vampire and human territories. His skills in negotiation and trade, even though they had previously been used for less noble purposes, could be redirected toward building something positive for the kingdom. The gasps from the crowd were audible. This was not revenge, this was not even forgiveness. This was something far more radical, something that challenged every assumption about how power should be used and how betrayal should be addressed. Alaric was taking the very people who had conspired against him and offering them the chance to become part of the solution instead of remaining part of the problem. He addressed the crowd once more, his voice rising with passion and conviction. He told them that Valdoria had been built on the revolutionary idea that former enemies could become allies, that vampires and humans could put aside centuries of hatred and learn to live together in peace. If that transformation was possible on a grand scale, why should it not be possible on a personal one? He refused to let betrayal make him into a smaller person, refused to let pain transform him into the kind of tyrant that his enemies had always accused him of being. Alina finally found her voice. She stepped forward and addressed her husband, her king, and the hundreds of witnesses who surrounded them. She confessed everything, holding nothing back, describing her loneliness, her feelings of being invisible, her stupid and selfish choices that had risked everything they had built together. She did not make excuses, did not try to justify what she had done, simply offered the truth as completely as she could. And when she was finished, she told Alaric that she did not deserve his forgiveness, did not deserve a second chance, but that if he was willing to give her one, she would spend the rest of her eternal existence trying to become worthy of it. The choice, Alaric said, was not his alone to make. A queen served the people, not just the king, and it was the people who would ultimately decide whether Alina could continue in her role. He proposed something unprecedented in the history of Valdoria, a period of service and redemption. For the next 10 years, Alina would step back from her official duties as queen and would instead work directly with the poorest and most vulnerable citizens of the kingdom, not as a ruler bringing charity from above, but as an equal sharing in their struggles and helping to solve their problems. During this time, she would have no special privileges, no access to the treasures and luxuries of the castle, no authority over others. She would have to earn back the trust of the kingdom one person at a time, one act of service at a time, one day at a time. And at the end of 10 years, if the people believed she had genuinely changed, genuinely grown, genuinely become someone worthy of leading them, she would be welcomed back to her full position. If not, she would accept whatever judgment they rendered. Alina agreed immediately, not because she had any other option, but because she finally understood what her husband was offering her. It was not mercy, not exactly. It was something more difficult and more valuable than simple forgiveness. It was the chance to transform herself, to become the person she should have been all along, to earn through effort what she had previously taken for granted. It was, in its own way, the most profound punishment imaginable, because it required her to face herself honestly every single day for the next decade. The celebration continued after that, but everything had changed. The nobles of Valdoria had witnessed something they would never forget, a lesson in leadership that would influence generations to come. They had seen that true power was not about the ability to destroy those who wronged you, but about the wisdom to find paths forward that created more light in the world rather than more darkness. In the months and years that followed, Alina discovered that her redemption was far harder than any punishment could have been. She lived in a small house in one of the poorest districts of the kingdom, waking each day before dawn to help families who had nothing. She learned the names of every person in her community, listened to their stories, shared in their struggles, celebrated their small victories. She was transformed not by magic or by decree, but by the slow and difficult work of genuine change. Alaric watched from a distance, giving her space to grow while never completely closing his heart to the possibility of reconciliation. He too was transformed by the experience, becoming a more thoughtful and compassionate ruler, more willing to listen to those around him, more aware of the importance of the relationships that truly mattered. The kingdom of Valdoria flourished under this new understanding of leadership, becoming not just a place of peace between species, but a model of how grace and redemption could create something beautiful even from the ashes of betrayal. 10 years later, when Alina returned to the castle to face the judgment of the people, she was not the same woman who had left. She carried herself with a humility that came from genuine experience, and her eyes held a warmth that had been missing for far too long. The citizens she had served spoke on her behalf, describing not a queen doing penance, but a true friend who had changed their lives through her kindness and dedication. Alaric welcomed her back not as a triumphant ruler reclaiming his wayward queen, but as a man opening his heart to someone he had learned to respect in a completely new way. Their relationship would never be what it had been before, but what it became was something far stronger, built on honest communication, mutual respect, and the hard-earned wisdom that comes from facing the worst in oneself and choosing to become better. The story of the vampire king who chose redemption over revenge became legend throughout the known world. Other rulers came to Valdoria seeking to learn from Alaric's example, wanting to understand how he had transformed betrayal into an opportunity for growth. And Alaric always told them the same thing. True strength was not found in the power to destroy, but in the courage to build something beautiful even when everything seemed broken beyond repair. And in the end, that was his real revenge, proving that love and wisdom would always be more powerful than hatred and vengeance, and that even the deepest wounds could become the source of the greatest strength.